Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading A Victory That Matters. April 16, 2011. Better than victory over 1,000 is victory over one person yourself. This is a verse in the Dhammapada that points to some very important questions. What exactly do you want to win in this lifetime? What do you want to gain? What battles are worth fighting? The primary talent of a good warrior is knowing which battles are worth fighting, which ones are not, and knowing when it's time to accept defeat for the strategic purpose of coming out ahead somewhere else that matters a lot more. There are things we may want out of other people that they don't want to give, like respect, acknowledgement of our existence, or acknowledgement of our worth as a person. Then you have to ask yourself, is it really worth fighting for? What does the fighting accomplish? Is it going to gain any respect? And even if it does, how much is that respect worth? There are so many battles in the world that just lead to bad karma even when you win, sometimes especially when you win. Look at the history of the world when nations that won battles ended up being transformed into the enemy, taking on the enemy's characteristics. Is this what you want? At the same time, when you win a battle, you gain the animosity of those who lost. This is why the Buddha said that it's better to focus on the battles inside, battles over your own defilements, greed, aversion, and delusion. Those are the battles that can be won, and when you win, you don't create any bad karma. As for whether the people outside will acknowledge your victory, that doesn't really matter. In fact, as Ajahn Lee once said, things that other people know about aren't safe. You know for yourself, nobody else has to know. Look at the history of Buddhism. Where is the history of those who truly gained awakening? Although some people reportedly have gained awakening, either through their own report or through the belief of their followers, who really knows? It's something purely internal, that's where it matters most. There's another thing that's purely internal as well. That's your experience of suffering. We each suffer, however, we can't feel another person's suffering. We can sometimes sense that they're suffering, although we can't actually feel their pain. We only can feel ours. It's the subjective experience. The Buddha points out that the suffering that really weighs down on the mind is not the suffering that comes from other people. It's the suffering you cause yourself. So, if you can win that battle, you've won the one that really matters. Look at the ways you're causing yourself to suffer. This, according to the Buddha, is the issue to which we should give primary importance, and yet for the most part we're ignorant of it, and that ignorance is a prime part of the problem. He defines ignorance not so much as ignorance of his teachings as a whole, but more ignorance of the Four Noble Truths and the tasks appropriate to them. Comprehending suffering, abandoning its cause, realizing its cessation, and developing the path to its cessation. Just knowing those things doesn't end the problem. You have to actually look at things in terms of the Noble Truths and treat them in line with the tasks appropriate to those truths, until you can master those tasks to the point of completion. That's when your ignorance is ended. How are you going to comprehend suffering? How are you going to let go of its cause and realize its cessation? By developing the path. What in the mind fights that by saying that other things you'd rather do are more important? The part of the mind that tosses up all kinds of obstacles. You could go along with the obstacles and block your path, or you can take the Buddha's approach by looking at how suffering feels from the inside, and how all the processes that lead to suffering feel from the inside. One of the processes you have to watch from the inside is the process of rebirth. An issue that comes up often with people who object to the idea of rebirth is that they want a clear explanation from the Buddha on the mechanics of rebirth, on what it would look like to an outside observer. How could it work, especially given our modern scientific view on how things work? It doesn't make any sense, they say. So they cling to a materialistic view, as if holding everything to the test of a materialistic view would prove or disprove it. But has the materialistic view made us happy? It's provided us with some conveniences. It solved any number of material problems. But it has never made people happy deep down inside. It certainly hasn't made them better people than they were before. The human race is just as savage as it was before the scientific revolution. That should indicate that the materialistic view doesn't have the final word on things. It's like the MBA approach to business, where only profit matters. When everything else has to be sacrificed for profit, see what happens. Everything does get sacrificed. Societies break down. The social fabric gets torn apart. This is what happens when a narrow view becomes ascendant and demands to be ascendant in every area. It's not just now that people are challenging the Buddha about the metaphysics of rebirth. Back in his time it was a controversial issue, too. One of the major fallacies that you hear repeatedly is that the Buddha just picked up the idea of rebirth from his culture because that's what everybody believed, and nobody thought to question it. People were questioning it. Is the life force the same thing as the body, or is it something else, separate from the body, something different from the body? That question was a hot issue at the time, and it was directly related to the question of rebirth. If the life force was something different from the body, then you had a metaphysical explanation for how rebirth could happen. If it was the same thing as the body, then rebirth would be impossible. But the Buddha refused to take a position on the question. It's one of those 10 questions he set aside. The battle of metaphysics is not worth winning. You say, what is it that takes rebirth? Where is it? Can you see it? But the question takes you nowhere. The Buddha entirely avoided the question of whether there was or was not a what behind the process, but he did explain how the process happens and how it's experienced from the inside. You wouldn't be responsible for the what anyhow, but you are responsible for the how. It's part of the suffering, birth, aging, illness, and death that comes from your craving. Because birth comes under the category of suffering, it's something you have to comprehend. You don't comprehend it in terms of somebody's theory about how the world works, but in terms of how you direct and experience the processes of the mind. This is where the battle is really important, because it's through craving that rebirth happens. Think of the 4 Dhamma summaries. The world is insufficient, there's no one in charge, it has nothing of its own, it's a slave to craving. Even though it's filled with things that are inconstant, stressful, and not self-aging, illness and death, craving keeps us coming back for all that unsatisfactory stuff. If you can't win out over that craving, you really haven't won anything worthwhile. The whole point of the 4 Noble Truths is that you're responsible for this craving, and you can put an end to it. And it's nothing far away. It's something you directly experience right here and now. This is why the Buddha's approach is what you might call phenomenology. How phenomena are directly experienced, without any reference to what there is behind that experience, and without trying to impose your ideas of what's behind experience on somebody else, or letting them impose theirs on you. You're meditating to look at exactly what your mind is doing right now to create the phenomenon of suffering. When you can see craving and ignorance in action, you've got the focal point for the really important battle, the battle of that. When you win it, you've won something really worthwhile. The big issue in life is that we don't want suffering, but we keep creating it. Ajahn Suwat would often say, it's through our own stupidity. He often translated ignorance as stupidity. It's happening right before our very eyes, right here in the mind. It's not some mysterious process off someplace else. It's causing suffering right before our eyes. The suffering is not off someplace else either. We're the ones who keep looking off someplace else while ignoring what's right here now. The meditation gives us tools to overcome that ignorance and craving. That's what we're basically getting victory over. We do this by seeing through these things and understanding why we're doing them. We think we can get some pleasure out of them, but we have to look very carefully at that pleasure to see why we're so attached to it. Here again, the problem isn't metaphysical. Our attachment doesn't come because we have some metaphysical belief about whether things have an essence or don't have an essence. That's pretty irrelevant. We cling to actions that we keep doing over and over because we're addicted to them, and we're addicted to them because we believe that the pleasure they give outweighs the pain they cause. We see it that way because we're not looking carefully. We're ignorant of our own actions. To overcome that ignorance, you need a good point of comparison against which you can measure that pleasure and pain. This is why you're practicing concentration. You try to develop a state of good solid concentration in the mind, with a sense of ease and well-being, that can come simply from being with the breath, being absorbed in the breath, filling the breath energy throughout the body with a sense of healthy energy. This puts you in a good position to compare things. You can look at the other pleasures you followed in life and ask, are they anything like this breath? Are they as steady, reliable, and harmless as this kind of pleasure? You're training yourself to be a connoisseur of pleasure, so that you can really understand where the pleasure lies, where the pain lies, and how things stack up. Which pleasure is greater? How about the pain of going back to your old ways of looking for pleasure? You see these things a lot more easily when you're coming from a vantage point of stable well-being. Even though concentration isn't the ultimate, it does give you a higher standard for understanding what true pleasure can be. It doesn't automatically wean you off of your old ways of thinking, but it gives you a basis for actually doing the work of contemplation, especially when you realize that following your daily pleasures gets in the way of this pleasure of concentration. You've got to make a choice. Once you admit that you've got to make the choice, then it's easier to sort through your other pleasures and start seeing which habits you're willing to sacrifice. When you can drop them, you've won a victory over the clinging, craving, and ignorance that kept you bound to those habits. This is where the victory really matters. As for what the people in the outside world might think, why do you want to gain victory over their hearts or their opinions? What does it accomplish? Especially if they're resistant. You just develop bad habits of pride and the desire to control others. You lose out to your own defilements, the kind of defeat that can really be harmful. Learn to see that defeat as a warning that you're focusing on the wrong battles. Then use that realization to set your heart on gaining a victory over your greed, aversion, and delusion, your craving, ignorance, and clinging, so that this very personal suffering that you're causing yourself can finally stop. Nobody else needs to praise you for this. Nobody else needs to know. When you reach this deathless element inside, it is its own reward, worth much more than the opinions of other people. Give it a chance. See if what the Buddha said was really right, that this is where true happiness lies, and that there's no other happiness that can compare. As he said, the flavor of the Dhamma beats all other flavors. So see if you can come to taste that flavor and decide whether he's right. Gratitude and Trust. October 12, 2010. Tonight marks the 20th anniversary of the founding of Wat Metta. It was on October 12, 1990, that the land was first purchased. And it's good to reflect on how much we owe to the people who first thought up the idea of having this monastery, and to the people whose gift of land, and whose development of the land into a monastery, have provided us with an opportunity to practice. Here there are two themes worthy of reflection. First is the Buddha saying, Visasa Paramanati, our foremost relatives are those for whom we feel trust. It was Ajahn Suwat who first thought up the idea of having this monastery. The donor of the land, the people who gave money and time and energy to get the monastery off the ground. They weren't related to us at all, and yet they had a sense of trust in future generations, that this would be a good thing to do, a good gift to give, and there would be people who would take good advantage of it. As the Buddha said, that relation through trust is much closer than our blood relations. If you're like me, you have some blood relatives for whom you feel no trust at all. The sense of relatedness there is pretty weak. But the people for whom you feel trust, that's a relatedness that's very strong, the kind of relatedness that keeps the world going and gives us a sense that human society is a worthwhile thing. Which relates to another topic. Gratitude. There's a saying that there are two people who are hard to find in the world. First is the person who's an upakari. Someone who helps you before receiving any help from you. Second is the person who's received that kind of help and feels gratitude in response. Both of these people should be cherished. There's a lot of misunderstanding around the topic of gratitude. We tend to confuse it with appreciation and contentment. Appreciation is what you feel for things or incidents from which you benefit, but no one else's good intentions are involved. An example of appreciation would be the story the Buddha tells of the man who has to cross over a river and realizes he's going to need a raft, so he makes the raft and then swims across in dependence on the raft. When he gets to the other side, he says, "How helpful this raft has been to me." That's a sense of appreciation. Without the raft, he wouldn't have gotten where he was. But the fact that he appreciates the raft doesn't mean that he has to carry it around with him from then on. He pulls it up on land or he sinks it down in the water near the shore and then goes on his way. In other words, with appreciation you realize that you have benefited from something and it can be a thing, and yet the need to respond is pretty minimal. In the case of something you can continue to use, you take care of it. And then there are cases of really negative events that help to turn you around. Someone may have done something that was really nasty, but you grew into a stronger person because of it. You want to have an appreciation for the fact that sometimes you do benefit from misfortune, but that doesn't carry the lesson that you should heap misfortune on other people for the sake of what you can rationalize as their benefit. With gratitude, though, you've benefited from someone's good action, and that does carry the lesson that good actions are needed for human society to continue. As for contentment, that simply means being happy with what you've got, realizing that you have good things and it's enough for the sake of the practice. The good things don't have to be all that good, but they can be good enough so that you don't have to keep scrambling for more. That's contentment. As for gratitude, that's more related to the teaching on karma. When the Buddha introduced the topic of gratitude, he did so in the context of explaining karma. After saying that there are good and bad actions that lead to good and bad results, he went on to say, there is mother and father, which sounds like a non sequitur, and something perfectly obvious, except for the fact that in those days there were people who said there is no such thing as mother or father. Meaning that your parents just gave birth to you because they were compelled by forces larger than themselves. Whoever created the universe decreed that they were going to give birth to you, so it involved no goodness on their part. The fact that they looked after you was also decreed by some outside force, so again, there was no goodness on their part. What this statement means, there is no mother or father, is that you don't owe them anything. So when the Buddha said, there is mother and father, he meant the opposite. That you do owe something to your parents. You owe a debt of gratitude because they were able to make the choice of whether they were going to care for you or not. It was their choice not to abort the pregnancy. It was their choice to teach you about the world. How to walk, how to talk, how to behave. And regardless of how foolish they may have been in other ways, and the Buddha admits that there are parents who are stingy and unvirtuous, and pretty ignorant even, then you owe a huge debt of gratitude to them for what they've done, because they had to make some difficult choices. It's not an easy thing to give birth to a child or to raise a child, and yet they made the difficult choice. That's what marks the whole issue of gratitude. People have the power to make choices. When the Buddha talks about gratitude, the language he uses focuses on words that derive from the root for action. Kar in Pali. There's upakari, the person who helped you to begin with, and to whom you owe a debt of gratitude. It literally means someone who acted first. And your response to that person should be that you are going to act in return, patikurosi.and. Even the word gratitude itself, katanu, means that you know what was done, you appreciate what was done. So gratitude is not just a general appreciation. It's specifically an appreciation for actions, realizing that you have a debt coming from other people's kind actions, a debt that requires you to do something in return. You have to return the goodness. And again, even though your parents may have been abusive, still the Buddha says you try to repay them by teaching them or at least being a good example for them. He says if your parents are stingy, you try to induce them to become more generous. If your parents are not virtuous, you try to induce them to be more virtuous. If they have no faith in the principle of action, you try to develop that sense of faith and conviction in them. And if they're not wise, you try to teach them the ways of wisdom. Of course, it's difficult to teach your parents. They don't like being taught by their children, but you can teach by example. That's one way of repaying the debt. But then there are cases where your parents are no longer around or the people who helped you are no longer around, as in the case of Luang Pu Suet, who was the first to think up the idea that we should have this monastery here. So how do you repay your debt to him? You think about his original intention and you try to maintain that intention. The goodness of his choice, the goodness of his ideas. You appreciate that goodness and then you try to act in a way that extends that goodness further through time. His intention was to have a place where people could practice. Quiet, secluded, with trees we could sit under. Think about the time of the Buddha, who was born under a tree, gained awakening under a tree, gave his first sermon under a tree, and passed away under a tree. To use Ajahn Suet's words, the institution of Buddhism was established in the forest. So he wanted there to be a place where you could really be out in the trees, out in the wilds, that offers both the seclusion that's needed to practice, and also some of the difficulties. We miss some of the conveniences of life in town here, or at least we don't have them, and it's a good test. If things were very comfortable, very easy, and very convenient, you'd have no test against which to measure your greed, aversion, and delusion. But the hardships aren't so overwhelming that we can't practice. That's the whole point. So that was his intention for starting this place. That's the meaning of this place. To keep maintaining the meaning of the place, you want to keep practicing. We're indebted to the people who have made this possible, and so the best way to repay that debt is to focus on the practice. The Thai way of expressing this is that other people have started weaving something, and so you continue the weaving. You don't let the edges get all frayed. This is what gratitude is all about. It's a sense not only that you appreciate the choices that people made, but also that you need to respond. The word patikaroti means to repay or to make amends, but it can also mean to imitate. In other words, you imitate the goodness that they did, the intention that they had. You try to carry that out. That's the response that keeps their goodness alive. There's that question that people would often ask Ajahn Fuang. How can I repay you for having taught me? And his response was, be really intent on the practice. That's the best repayment right there. So this is why the Buddha's teachings on gratitude are all surrounded by words that deal with action. You appreciate someone's good actions, and then you realize there's an action that's called for from you, an appropriate response. That's what makes it different from appreciation or contentment. As the Buddha said, it's a characteristic of a good person to feel gratitude and to want to repay that debt in one way or another. This is why Ajahn Fuang would often say, if he saw someone who is ungrateful to his or her parents, that you don't want to have anything to do with that person, for that person doesn't value goodness. If that person doesn't value the goodness of his or her parents, you can't trust that person to be good to you. Gratitude means that you value goodness, you appreciate the difficulties that are involved in making the skillful choice and carrying it out. When you appreciate that and have gratitude for it, you're more likely to make the same kind of effort yourself. So keep in mind the distinction between gratitude on the one hand and attitudes like appreciation or contentment on the other. Someone said recently that gratitude is wanting what you have. That's actually a description of contentment or appreciation. Gratitude is more focused. It's focused on actions. The actions you've benefited from and the actions you feel called on to make in response to repay your debt of gratitude and to try to continue this stream of goodness into the world, on into the future, so all of the benefits that have been entrusted to us will bear fruit. That's how we show that we're worthy of that trust. An apprenticeship in integrity. July 9, 2011. There's a term that the Buddha often yokes with the phrase the noble ones, and that's people of integrity. A large part of the training is learning how to develop integrity. It's not just learning a few ideas or a few protocols. It's a quality of the heart, of your behavior, of your character. And it takes more than just understanding words to develop integrity. You need a well-directed intention and some good examples to absorb. There's a passage where the Buddha talks about 7 qualities of a person of integrity. Of the 7, 2 have to do with things that you can learn from books or from listening. But the other 5 have to do with things you can pick up only by being around people of integrity and trying to become a person of integrity yourself. The 2 qualities you can learn from books or from listening are knowledge of the Dhamma and knowledge of the meaning of the Dhamma. You can learn the Dhamma by listening and by reading, and a good part of the meaning you can pick up by trying to figure things out. Reading one sutta and then reading another one, comparing what they have to say. Trying to get a sense of what the Buddha meant when he was talking about, say, suffering or emptiness or any of those big terms that play a major role in the way he taught. But even here, it really helps to live around a person who has practiced the Dhamma, for it helps to put your ideas about the purpose and meaning of the Dhamma into perspective. Emptiness may seem to mean one thing in the abstract, but when you sense emptiness as it's embodied in another person, it can mean something else entirely. As for the other 5 qualities, the first is having a sense of yourself. Where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, where you can trust yourself, where you can't trust yourself, where you need to work on yourself. You could look in a whole library of books, you could look through the entire internet, and you would never find that kind of knowledge. You have to look at yourself in action, and you also have to be around people of integrity, so you get a sense of where you do and don't measure up and how they see where you do and don't measure up. It's not just a matter of your own opinion. You have to listen to their opinions, be sensitive to their standards. You have to read not only their words, but also their behavior and their body language. This is why the Buddha put so much emphasis on choosing a good teacher. You want a teacher who has high standards and holds to them, lives by them. That way you get to pick up high standards, too. The sense of your own strengths and weaknesses, and particularly this issue of where you can trust yourself and where you can't, takes a lot of time and sensitivity to develop. As the Buddha said, you have to be very observant and watch for a long time to gain this kind of knowledge. Another aspect of a person of integrity's knowledge is having a sense of time and place. Again, you can learn this only by being in lots of different times and lots of different places, and being around someone who is sensitive to time and place to see how that person deals with these times and places. When's the time to speak? When's the time not to speak? When's the time to act? When's the time not to act? That's something you can pick up only by being around someone who has developed that kind of sensitivity. And it requires that you be sensitive, too, that you be open to that person's influence. At the same time, you have to learn how to close yourself off to the influence of people who don't have that sense. Another aspect of integrity is having a sense of enough. How much is enough sleep? How much is enough food? How much is enough talk? How much is too little? You can extend these questions into all the areas of your life. And again, you can pick this up only by being around other people who have a sense of enough. It's all too easy to fall into a part of society where the values are really, really strange as to what constitutes enough. You hear about politicians who seem to be honest enough when you vote for them, but then they get into a different circle of friends or a different circle of society, and what was enough before is suddenly not enough. They stop being honest because they have to become two-faced and straddling two societies, showing one face to you and another to the society they want to inhabit, where there are different standards for what's worth competing over and what counts as success. So again, you want to find someone who has a really clear sense of what's enough and what's not enough based on the Buddha's reflections on the requisites: how much food is really enough, how much clothing, how much shelter, how much medicine. Another aspect of integrity is having a sense of groups of people. The Buddha describes this as knowing how to behave around Brahmins, how to behave around noble warriors, and so forth. For us, this would include knowing how to behave around upper-class people, lower-class people, people with a lot of education, people with very little education. How do you talk to people less educated than you, so that they won't feel you're talking down to them? How do you talk to people above you on the social scale so they won't feel you're after their money? More importantly, how do you talk with people? How do you behave toward them in a way that you can communicate with them, but not get sucked into whatever weird values they may have? Having a sense of groups like this is not just a matter of being pleasing to them. It's also a matter of holding to your standards. How do you not get sucked into their standards? How do you do that in such a way that you're not cutting off all ties with those people? This is a delicate issue. To learn this, you have to be around the sort of person who has that kind of sense and demonstrates it in action. Finally, there's a sense of how to judge people. According to the Buddha standards, you judge people by the extent to which they're really sincere in wanting to learn the Dhamma. Once they've learned the Dhamma, to what extent are they sincere in trying to understand it? Once they understand it, to what extent do they try to apply it to their lives? Those are the areas where you judge people. You don't judge them by their race, you don't judge them by their occupation, you don't judge them by their age. The whole point of this, of course, is that the standards you use to judge other people are the ones you want to use to judge yourself. To what extent are you sincerely interested in the Dhamma, sincerely interested in putting it into practice? These are values that you pick up by being around people who exemplify them, people who are people of integrity. This is one of the reasons why the relationship that the Buddha prescribed for a teacher and a student is one of an apprenticeship. The word antavasika, which they use for the student of a mentor in the monkhood, is the same word for apprentice in all kinds of occupations. The various protocols of the apprentice. How the student is supposed to behave in relationship to the preceptor, in relationship to the mentor are very much an apprentice kind of relationship. You live together. In fact, that's the word for the student who lives with a preceptor. Sadimvaharika, one who lives together. You live with your preceptor. You spend a lot of time with the preceptor, you regard the preceptor as your father, the preceptor's supposed to regard you as his son. And you really look after each other. When the preceptor's sick, you look after him. When you're sick, the preceptor looks after you. You learn to get sensitive to the preceptor's needs because you're not just trying to pick up verbal knowledge from him. You want to gain a sense of him as a person in all sorts of situations. What did this person learn from the training when he was apprenticed? What kind of qualities did he pick up? I don't know if I can exemplify all the qualities that Ajahn Fuang exemplified, but one quality in particular that I really felt comfortable with and I really admired him for was his solidity in the face of antagonism. There were pressures from the local people to drop this rule, drop that rule, play favorites this way or that, and he wouldn't give in, wouldn't give in. He was solid across the board. If that meant being unpopular, that was perfectly fine with him. Once he was going to choose the treasurer for the monastery and he finally spotted someone he felt he could trust. But just to make sure, he asked the guy a question. It was an interesting question. He said, "Which would you prefer? To be popular or to be wealthy?" And the guy said, "I'd rather be wealthy because if you have money you can buy popularity." Ajahn Fuang liked the answer. Take that and think about it for a while. When you're dealing with someone who's caring for the money at the monastery, you don't want someone who's concerned about being popular. That sort of person will give in to pressure one way or another to misuse the monastery funds. And sure enough, I saw the treasurer have to stand up to a lot of pressure. Successfully. He was a good example to be around. So learning the Dhamma is not just a matter of reading books and understanding the words in the books. It's a matter of picking up good habits of observing, habits of walking, and habits of looking, talking. Everything you do is part of the training. Which is why the Dhamma is not so much something you find in books, it's a quality of the heart you can absorb over time by being observant. This is something that's lost nowadays. People think they can read the Dhamma and interpret it in whatever way they want, and then set themselves up as Dhamma teachers. I was just reading recently someone saying, well, as we all know, meaning is a construct, meaning is something you create, So everybody has the freedom to read whatever meaning they want out of the texts, and nobody can say that anyone else is wrong. With that attitude, the Dhamma becomes just one more thing to be creative about. But that wasn't the Buddha's purpose in teaching. His purpose was to lay out the steps of what's required to put an end to suffering, what works and doesn't work. And he learned what works and doesn't work by testing things in action. Then, when he had tested the Dhamma and tested himself, he taught the Dhamma and set up a social framework to help pass the entire body of skills along. So the texts are there within a context. The teachings of the Dhamma, the rules of the Vinaya, are all in this context of the apprenticeship. Picking up qualities of the heart, picking up a sense of values from being around someone whose behavior is Dhamma. After all, the whole idea of putting an end to suffering is a very strong statement of values right there, that this is the important issue in life. When the Buddha was talking about the Four Noble Truths, he wasn't just telling us information about the Four Noble Truths. He was asserting a value, that this is the most important way of looking at things to help attain the most important goal you can set for yourself: putting an end to suffering. So to understand him, you have to understand not only the words he uses to describe suffering, its cause, its cessation, and the path to its cessation. You have to understand why all this is important, why he gives this such high priority. When Westerners first encountered the texts out of context, they'd say, "Oh, this is a very selfish, very narrow approach to spiritual life." But my experience of going to Thailand and living with the Ajahns was these were not selfish or narrow people at all. They really had something special and they wanted to share it. This was evident in everything they did. So there's the aspect of the Dhamma that you can pick up only by being around people who have trained in the Dhamma, who have been trained by their teachers who in turn were well trained. People who have been willing to apprentice themselves to pick up the values. In the past, this aspect of direct personal example was highly valued, not just in the area of the Dhamma, but in terms of other skills as well. There are a lot of old skills that used to be practiced in Thailand that have died out because the teachers didn't see anyone worthy of passing them on to. And the question of worthiness had to do with the character of the student. I once became friends with a woman in Bangkok, Pa Pha, who had been born in the palace. Her father had been the head musician of the Royal Orchestra, composed of xylophones, gongs, and other classical Thai instruments during the time of Rama VI. So Pa Pha was born in the palace and spent her childhood there, part of which involved learning how to cook from the palace cooks. And she learned her lessons well. She knew all kinds of clever and unusual cooking skills. Even after she had left the palace and had to make a living on her own after her husband died, she developed a really good reputation as a cook. In fact, other women came to study with her. She told me once, though, that one woman in particular, a mutual acquaintance, was really begging her to teach her how to cook, and her response was, "I don't want to teach this woman, she's too flighty." You may not think that flightiness had anything to do with cooking, but her attitude was that she had something really valuable in her cooking knowledge. And she didn't want to waste her time training someone who didn't have the character to be a good cook. As far as I know, she ended up teaching only 3 other people how to cook. And her highest praise for me one time was when she said, "You know, if you were a layperson, I'd teach you how to cook." I took that as a huge compliment. So what we're learning here is not just the words. It's a quality of the heart and a quality of the character. If you're open to learning that dimension, these are the things you have to look at. Gaining a sense of yourself, gaining a sense of time and place, gaining a sense of how much is enough, how much is too little, how much is too much. Getting a sense of how to behave around different groups of people, and then gaining a sense of how to judge people by their character so that you start judging yourself by your character. You need to develop integrity in order to know what integrity is. All of these qualities go together and they play a huge part in the training. So it's not just a meditation technique that we're learning here, and not just a few statements about the truth. We're learning how to be a true person, a person of integrity, trying to adopt and live up to the same standards the Buddha used when he defined what a person of integrity was. The breath all the way. October 2, 2010. Mindfulness of breathing, keeping the breath in mind, is the meditation theme the Buddha taught more than any other, and he praised it highly. He said that it can take you all the way to clear knowledge and release. Clear knowledge of awakening, release from all suffering and stress. It's also the meditation theme he taught in most detail. You can think of it as your home as a meditator. You may need to go foraging out in other areas, using other themes to deal with specific problems that come up in the mind, but it's good to have the breath as home base, a safe place you come back to. The Buddha was once advising the monks to practice breath meditation, and one of the monks said, "I already practice breath meditation." So the Buddha asked him, "What kind of breath meditation do you practice?" The monk replied, "I put aside thoughts of the past, don't hanker after thoughts of the future, and try to keep the mind at equanimity in the present as I breathe in, breathe out." The Buddha said, "Well, there is that kind of breath meditation, but it's not the most beneficial, not the most productive." Then he went on to teach breath meditation in 16 steps. So it's good to know the steps, because these are the most effective ways of making the breath into your home base. The steps come in 4 sets, and each set follows a pattern. You sensitize yourself to an aspect of the mind focusing on the breath in the present, then you notice how that aspect is fabricated, in other words, how it's shaped by your present intentions, and then you try to calm the fabrication. In the first set, the aspect is the breath itself, as part of your experience of the body. In the second set, the aspect you're focusing on concerns the feelings created by the way you pay attention to the breath. In the third set, the aspect you're focusing on is the state of the mind as it tries to stay with the breath. And in the fourth set, you focus on the mental qualities that are involved in developing dispassion for the whole process of fabrication. Because of the focus on fabrication, this is an insight practice. Because you're using your understanding of fabrication to bring those fabrications to calm, it's a tranquility practice. So you're working on insight and tranquility in tandem, which makes this an ideal practice for awakening. You begin with a simple exercise to make you sensitive to the breath, being mindful to notice when the breath is long and when it's short. You can expand on this exercise to notice other variations in your breathing as well. When it's heavy or light, deep or shallow, noticing whether it's comfortable or not. When you can be sensitive to these variations in the breath, the Buddha gets you to become more actively involved in the breathing process. You train yourself to be aware of the whole body as you breathe in, aware of the whole body as you breathe out. This requires some skill and practice, for you have to learn how to expand your sense of awareness and keep it expanded throughout the body without at the same time losing focus. One way to approach this is to practice going through the body section by section, noticing how the sensation of breathing feels in different parts of the body. How does it feel in your abdomen? How does it feel in your chest? How does it feel in your head? How does it feel in your back, in your shoulders, your arms, your legs? Remember that breathing is a whole body process. We think of it primarily as the air coming in and out of the lungs, but there's an energy flow that goes throughout the entire body each time you breathe in, each time you breathe out. It's beneficial to be aware of it in the different parts of the body to make sure it's comfortable in each part, and that the different parts are working together and not at cross purposes. So make a survey throughout the different parts of the body to familiarize yourself with how the breathing feels. That right there is a project that can occupy you for the whole hour. You can do it for many days to get more and more sensitive to the breathing. Think of it as a way of showing goodwill for yourself and goodwill for other people, goodwill in the sense that, as you're learning how to breathe comfortably, you're learning how to create a sense of well-being that doesn't have to depend on things outside. It just feels good breathing in, feels good breathing out. When the breathing feels good, you're going to be much less irritable, much less likely to feel oppressed by the situations around you. So even when things go badly outside, you don't sense that they're weighing on you because you've got your own space right here where you can still breathe comfortably. Having the safe inner space is an act of kindness for others as well, because when you're coming from a comfortable spot here, a comfortable sensation here in the body, you're less likely to act on greed, aversion, delusion, or any of the other ways of being unskillful with others. That way, other people will suffer less from your defilements. This is an essential principle throughout the Buddha's teachings. That if you care for your mind really well, you're not the only person who benefits. The image that the Buddha gives is of two acrobats. The story goes that an acrobat once said to his assistant, "Okay, you get up on my shoulders and we'll get on top of the bamboo pole. Then you look out after me and I'll look out after you, and that way we'll come down safely." But his assistant said, "No, that's not going to work at all. You look out after yourself, I'll look out after myself, and that way we help one another to come down safely." In other words, you look out after your balance, because you can't really look out for other people's balance. The best way you can help them is to look out after your balance, and in doing so you don't knock them off balance. So, in helping yourself, you're helping others. This is true for all the Buddha's teachings. When you're generous, you help yourself and you help others. When you're virtuous, you help yourself and you help others. When you spread thoughts of goodwill, you help yourself, you help others. When you meditate in other ways, you help yourself and you help others. This helps to blur the line between who's helping whom, or who's going to benefit from your practice. You're not the only person benefiting when you're meditating, in the same way that, when you're generous with other people, they're not the only people benefiting. You're benefiting as well. The Buddha teaches a form of happiness that doesn't have boundaries. And as a step in that direction, you need to train your awareness to be more expansive until its boundaries dissolve. This is what you start doing in the third and fourth steps of the first set, where you train yourself to be aware of the whole body as you breathe in, the whole body as you breathe out. Then you try to calm the breathing. This doesn't mean that you stifle it or stop it. It simply means that you allow the breath energies to interconnect and grow more coordinated, so that breath naturally grows more gentle. In any places where the breath feels harsh, you think of it getting lighter and more soothing. One way you can do this is to think of the breath energy coming in and out of the body through every pore, so it requires less effort on your part to breathe in, to breathe out. That's the first set of 4 steps in breath meditation. Being aware of short breathing, long breathing, training yourself to be aware of the whole body as you breathe in and breathe out, and then training yourself to allow the breath to grow calm as you breathe in, breathe out, so it feels gentle and soothing. The next 4 steps have to do with feelings. First, you train yourself to breathe in and out sensitive to rapture. The word rapture here can also mean refreshment. Ask yourself, what kind of breathing would feel refreshing right now? Remember that feelings don't simply come and go on their own. The mind helps to fabricate them. In other words, there's an intentional element in every feeling. The way you focus on the breath can give rise to feelings of refreshment if you do it right. So, ask yourself, how can I breathe in a way that would feel refreshing, feel full throughout the body, full as I breathe in, full, even as I breathe out? Once you've mastered that, the next step is to breathe in a way that feels easeful and pleasant. The difference between refreshment and pleasure is that refreshment is like coming across a glass of water after you've been out in the desert. It's a very intense, energetic pleasure, sometimes so intense or overwhelming that it's actually unpleasant. Pleasure, however, is cooler, gentler, more easeful. Once the breath gives rise to feelings of ease, the Buddha tells you to breathe in and out sensitive to what he calls mental fabrication, to see how the feelings induced by the breath have an effect on your mind, and how your perceptions have an effect on the mind as well. Perceptions are labels, the words or mental images you apply to things to identify them to yourself, such as the labels you apply to the breath. What kind of mental image do you have of the breathing? If you think of the body as a big bellows that you have to pump to pull the breath in and push the breath out, that's going to make the breath coarse and tiresome. It's not going to be so easeful and soothing for the mind. But if you think of the body as a large sponge with lots of holes that allow the breath to come in and go out, just holding that perception in mind eases the breathing process. It's also a more easeful perception to hold in your mind. It has a more calming effect on the mind. If you find that your breathing is laborious, you can think of the breath energy coming in and out of the forehead, down from the top of the head, in through your eyes, in through your ears, in from the back of the neck going down your back, in at your throat going down through the chest to the heart. Just hold those images in mind and see what impact they have on the breathing and on your mind. In the next step, the Buddha says to try to find the perception or feeling that's most calming to the mind. If you find that the sponge perception is more calming, you hold on to that. If it's more easeful to think of the breath coming down from the top of the head, or in and out of the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, then hold those perceptions in mind. There are lots of different perceptions you can play with. Try to find the ones that are most calming for you right here, right now. Those are the 4 steps that deal with feeling. The next 4 steps deal with the mind. To begin with, you just want to be aware of the state of your mind as you breathe in, the state of your mind as you breathe out. As you do this, you want to notice if it's in balance or out of balance. If it's out of balance, there are different ways you can deal with it. If the mind is feeling depressed, sluggish, or stale, ask yourself how you could breathe in, how you could breathe out in a way that would be gladdening to the mind. What kind of breathing would give energy to the mind, give refreshment to the mind? Or you can branch out and use other topics of meditation to gladden the mind as well. Think about the Buddha to see if that creates a sense of gladness. Try thinking about the Dhamma, the Sangha. See if that gives a sense of gladness. Think about the times you've been virtuous or generous in the past, and see if that's encouraging. In other words, any Dhamma topic that helps to gladden the mind. You can bring that in and use it. Then, when it's done its work, go back to the breath and try to maintain that sense of gladness. Alternatively, if the mind is feeling scattered or restless, what kind of breathing could steady it? Or what other meditation topics could steady it? Here you might find that if you're feeling lazy and don't really want to meditate, you can focus on the reflection on death, or on those 5 reflections we chanted just now. Remembering that you're subject to aging, illness, death, and separation. The only things you really can hold on to are your actions. Where do your actions come from? They come from the mind. And if your mind isn't trained, what's it going to do? A lot of unskillful things. So the best way to prepare for aging, illness, and death is to train the mind. Thinking about death can have a riveting effect on the mind. You can try the contemplation that the Buddha recommends. Every morning at dawn, as you see the sun rise, remind yourself, this could be your last sunrise. Are you ready to go? The usual answer is no. Well, why not? What changes need to be made in the mind so that you would be ready to go? After all, very few people know, at sunrise, that this is going to be their last day. You could be one of those people. So you don't want to be heedless, you don't want to be caught off guard. Thinking in this way is an encouragement to practice. It focuses the mind. Then again, at sunset, the Buddha said, remind yourself that this could be your last sunset, you might die tonight. Are you ready to go? If the answer is no, you've got work to do. And you know what work you've got to do. You need to train the mind at the very least, get it more steady, more resilient. Train it to let go of all its foolish attachments. That requires work. You need training. When these thoughts have focused the mind, bring that focus back to the breath. Finally, if the mind is feeling burdened, figure out how to release it from its burdens, particularly if it's being burdened with unskillful thinking. These might be thoughts of sensuality or thoughts of anger. How can you let go of those? Sometimes you focus on the object of the thinking, sometimes on the thinking itself. If the object is one that excites desire, look at the side that's not so desirable. This is why we have the contemplation of the body. The body may look pretty on the surface, but if you took off the skin, you couldn't look at it at all. You'd run away. And yet why is it, with just that little film of skin wrapping it up, that we perceive it as attractive? What's the mind doing to itself? What games is it playing with itself, so it focuses only on the things that it perceives as attractive and blots out everything else? Similarly with anger. Usually, when you're feeling angry at somebody, all you can do is focus on their unattractive side, the unappealing side, the unpleasant side. You can work yourself up into a real fury. But are you really being fair? Are you being fair to the other person? Are you being fair to yourself? After all, who's suffering from your anger? You're certainly suffering from it right now. So if you find that the mind is being burdened by things like this, you find ways of unburdening it. The Buddha takes this even deeper, into the subtlest levels of concentration. Each level has a certain element of stress that's very subtle, but it's there. When the mind gets focused on a level of concentration, sit with it for a while to get to know it really well, until you recognize what's really going on in that state of concentration. This can take a while, because when you first hit a new level of concentration, you often don't really see the whole thing. You see that the mind seems less stressful than before. You don't see any stress in this concentration at all. But you have to get familiar with it until you begin to see that there is still a little bit of inconsistency, a little bit of wavering in the concentration, or there are certain mental activities that are a little bit burdensome, not much, but enough so that you can notice the variations in the stress. When you notice these activities and can see that they're unnecessary, then you can drop them. This last step combines both insight and tranquility. Insight into the tranquility, and tranquility in response to the insight. As the Buddha says, insight is what releases the mind from ignorance, tranquility is what releases the mind from passion. They have to work together for the release from any burden from the gross to the refined to be complete. That's the last of the steps dealing with the state of the mind as a whole. But it moves you into the final set of 4 steps, which have to do with what they call dhammas, or mental qualities. The component factors that go into shaping the state of the mind. The first step in this final set is learning how to look at inconstancy. Sometimes this word, anicca, is translated as impermanence, but the issue is not so much that things are impermanent, it's just that they keep changing unreliably. If you think about that mountain over there, the mountain is impermanent, but you can tell yourself, at least it's solid enough for me. I could build a house on it and not worry about the ocean washing it away in my lifetime. But if you apply the perception of inconstancy to the things you depend on for your happiness, you see that if there's even the slightest bit of change or unreliability in those things, it's threatening. That's what the Buddha is pointing to. There are so many things in life that we pin our happiness on, pin our hopes on, but you have to look carefully at them to see if they really are dependable. They change right before your eyes. Even the state of concentration, which in the beginning seems so solid, after a while, shows some wavering. It, too, has its ups and downs. And so the question is, what's causing that? What is the mind doing that's creating that rise and fall in the level of stress? This is where you begin to get into the 4 noble truths. As the Buddha said, each truth has a duty. The duty with regard to stress is to comprehend it, which means watching it carefully, so you can see exactly what it is in particular, to see where it's coming from and then develop dispassion, both for the stress and for its cause. This is why watching inconstancy is an important part of seeing stress, because it allows you to see that the level of stress will go up and go down, which signals that certain things are happening in the mind to cause it to go up, and other things are happening to cause it to go down. But what are those things? Feelings and perceptions. This is why the Buddha has you get sensitive to mental fabrication. What are your perceptions right now? What are the feelings? What are the perceptions that you apply, say, to pleasure, that you apply to pain? And how do they increase or decrease the level of stress in the mind? If you see that they cause an increase, drop them, because that's the duty with regard to the cause of stress. To abandon it, to let it go. You do this by developing the path, which we've been doing all the way through, with all these steps of meditation, so you can induce the sense of dispassion that allows you to abandon the cause of stress. That's why we look at inconstancy. To get a sense of dispassion for the things we're attached to. You really have to understand what attachment is all about. You're attached to things because they give pleasure, and even when you're attached, you can admit that the pleasure's not constant and that it takes some effort. Still, it seems that you get at least enough pleasure to make the effort worthwhile. But what the Buddha wants you to see is that the pleasure is not worth the effort at all, that the drawbacks of that particular pleasure are much greater than the actual nourishment you get from it. After all, the mind tends to delude itself. It sees its pleasures as wonderful. It paints them up. It dresses them up. It elaborates on them so they seem much more wonderful than they actually are. The Buddha wants you to really look at that fact, that process in action. What is the gratification you get out of that pleasure? What are the drawbacks of that pleasure? It's through this kind of analysis that you gain the insight allowing you actually to let go of things. If you simply see things as empty, as changing in line with conditions, you can drop them temporarily, but they come back because there's still a part of the mind that says, well, even if they're changing with conditions, the pleasure I get out of them is worth the effort I put into getting those conditions right. That's what you have to look into. Where is the actual pleasure here? Where is the effort? Where's the pain and stress in the effort? Do they give you a good deal or a bad deal? That's what it comes down to. What kind of deal are you giving yourself? The Buddha has you look at this until you see how you've been fooling yourself. To see the foolishness on both sides, the side that likes to deceive and the side that likes to be deceived gives rise to a sense of disenchantment and dispassion. That's the next step, focusing on dispassion, because it's through passion that we get involved with things to begin with. We get attached to them. We create these things. As the Buddha said, in every experience of form, feeling, perception, fabrication, and consciousness, there's an intentional element. A thought arises in the mind and you get involved, turning it into a state of becoming, a little world in which you can dwell. A feeling arises, and you elaborate on it. A perception arises and either you go with it or you don't. But there's a choice being made there. Sometimes the arising of these things comes from past karma, but then it's up to you to decide whether you want to go with them or not. That decision is your present karma. It's like somebody driving up in a car and saying, okay, jump in, let's go. You actually have the choice to jump in or not jump in, and if you're wise you're going to ask, who are you? Where are you going? What's going to happen if I jump in? That's if you're wise, because it turns out that this is not going to be a free ride. You're going to have to pay for the gas. Will it be worth it? You may actually have to pedal the car. If it turns out to be a pedal car, is it worth it? And where is the driver planning to take you? Is he going to rob you, kill you, and dump you off the side of the road? When you see that it's not worth it, your mind grows calm in the face of any temptation to jump in the car. That's the tranquility that follows on discernment and releases you from passion. Dispassion comes in its place, and when the dispassion comes, fabrications begin to stop because what keeps them going is your passion. When there's no passion, fabrications all cease. So you watch them ceasing, because of dispassion. That's the third step in the last set of 4. Focusing on cessation. Then the final step of breath meditation is to stay focused on relinquishment as you breathe in and out. You let go of everything. Even the path gets abandoned at this point because you don't need it anymore. It's like having a set of tools. As long as you have to work with the tools, you take good care of them, you look after them. But there comes a point when the job is done and you let even the tools go. In other words, all your attachment even to the path, the concentration, the discernment gets abandoned at that point as well each time you breathe in, each time you breathe out. So this is the kind of breath meditation, the Buddha says, that gives great rewards. It develops the 4 establishings of mindfulness, it develops all the 7 factors for awakening. You're developing mindfulness in keeping the breath in mind. As you analyze how you're doing this practice skillfully or unskillfully, how you're fabricating your sense of the body and mind in the present through the breath and the feelings and perceptions around the breath, that develops the analysis of qualities as a factor for awakening. You try to do your best to fabricate these things in skillful ways and abandon any unskillful fabrications. That's your persistence, energy, effort as a factor for awakening. As you do these things skillfully, refreshment and ease arise. Those are the rapture and the serenity factors for awakening. You develop concentration and the ability to watch with equanimity all these things as they're happening. When you have all these 7 factors together, they're the qualities you need to bring the mind to awakening. And these factors are all being developed as you practice these 16 steps. As the Buddha said, these factors lead to knowledge and release the knowledge of awakening, understanding what the mind's been doing that's been causing stress, how it can let go of the cause. When you've completed all the duties with regard to the 4 noble truths, the mind is released and no longer creates any unnecessary burdens for itself. It tastes the deathless. So this is what breath meditation can do. It's not just a preliminary exercise. It's a path that can take you all the way. You can augment it with other practices, as I've said. When the mind needs gladdening or steadying, when you find that you're stuck with unskillful mental qualities, you can use other techniques to pry the mind free from them. But the breath is where you always come back. It's your home because it's right here, where the body and the mind meet. It's the ideal place to watch both what's going on in the body and what's going on in the mind. And it's one of the few bodily functions you can control to give rise to a sense of well-being that allows you to stay steadily right here. This way you can begin to see things as they actually are, as they're actually happening and being fabricated, to see where your habits of fabrication are causing unnecessary suffering and stress. You come to see that the stress is actually unnecessary. There are choices you're making as you fabricate your experience out of the raw materials that come from past actions, and, through the path, you learn how to make these choices more and more skillful to the point where there's really nothing more to do. Everything is at perfect equilibrium. Any further intention either to stay there or to move on would just cause stress. And you see this clearly. At that point the mind lets go. So whatever other meditation you practice, make sure that at the very least, you've got your home base covered. As the Buddha said, when you get involved in other meditation topics, unskillful states can sometimes arise, in which case you should always come back to the breath. He compared it to the beginning of the rainy season in India. During the hot season everything is dry with lots and lots of dust in the air. But when the first rains come, they wash all the dust out of the air and leave the air very clean, clear, and refreshing. The same way with breath meditation. When you do it right, it can clear the mind, refresh the mind, wash away all its dust. So give time to this skill because it's the most basic skill in training the mind. It's your foundation, and you want to make sure the foundation is strong. If you try to build a building with a weak foundation, it's going to fall over. No matter how beautiful the building may be, it's going to collapse. But when the foundation is strong, you can build as many stories as you like and you don't have to worry about them falling down at all. Your main foundation. November 21, 2011. When you focus on the breath, you've got all 4 frames of reference right here. The breath is a manifestation of the body. Then there are feelings. Feelings can either be physical or mental. They come basically down to pleasure, pain, and neither pleasure nor pain. Then you've got mind states, such as a mind that's impassioned, a mind that's not impassioned, a mind that's aversive or not. This analysis of mind states works its way up to more subtle things, like a mind that's concentrated or not, or a mind that has reached a state beyond which it has ever been before or not. Those deal with more refined states of concentration. And then finally there are mental qualities, things that get in the way of your concentration like the hindrances, or things that help your concentration, like the factors for awakening. Often it's hard to make clear distinctions among these things, especially on the mental side. For example, with mental feelings. The feeling part of the mental feeling is the feeling tone, either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. But rarely do we have feelings that are simply positive, or negative, or neutral. We have stories that go along with them and color the particular feeling. Those stories come from perception and fabrication in the mind, which gets you more into the framework of mind states or mental qualities. Also, the line between mind states and mental qualities is very hard to pin down. You might think of the mind state as being when the whole mental committee has agreed on something, whereas the mental qualities are the specific members of the committee. The clearest line is between bodily phenomena and mental phenomena, and that's an important distinction to focus on. You've got the breath coming in and going out, and then you've got the mind here, liking and disliking, making up all kinds of stories, and then reacting to those stories one way or another. Either seeing a story is really fascinating and wanting to follow through with it, or realizing that it's not a very skillful story and learning how to separate yourself out from it. That's one of the ways in which these different ways of analyzing mental phenomena are helpful. When you can see mental phenomena simply as mental phenomena, and not as a world that you've got to enter into or one that you've got to believe, that gives you a certain measure of safety right there, a certain amount of protection, the ability to pull yourself out. This is where the body is helpful. When you can stay with the sensation of the body, that helps to prevent you from getting totally wrapped up in a particular mind state. Think of the fact that you've got breath here, you've got the different elements, earth, water, fire, that you feel as solidity, liquidity, warmth. If you keep these as your frame of reference, it helps keep you from being sucked into the other frames of reference, or helps you see them as frames of reference, rather than getting sucked into them as worlds. When the Buddha talked about a practice that helps develop all four frames of reference, he pointed to breath meditation. With every framework, you're always conscious of the breath, regardless of whether you're dealing with body, feelings, mind states, or mental qualities. You never lose your reference to the breath, even when you're trying to develop things like dispassion. You try to breathe in a way that develops dispassion, or you notice how you're breathing when dispassion arises. You notice how you're breathing as you're contemplating inconstancy. You try to stay anchored here with the body. This is why so much is focused here, because if you don't have this anchor, it's like being pulled into the clouds, carried off by the winds. You don't know where you'll eventually come down to earth. But when you have something to anchor yourself to the ground, you don't get pulled away. There may be some pull, but you can resist it. You don't lose your bearings and you know where you are. So it's important to realize how much you need to have a really solid foundation here with the body, and not be in too great a hurry to move on to some other frame of reference. Even when you're aware of feelings or mind states, you want to have your body here as a post. Remember the image the Buddha gave of the 6 different types of animals tied together by a leash. If they're not tied to a post, then whichever animal happens to be strongest is going to drag all the rest off in the direction it wants to go. But if they're tied to a post, they can only go so far, and it doesn't matter which one is stronger than the others. They're all right here. Then as you're right here, you can notice what else is going on inside the mind. It's not that when you're aware of the breath you're aware only of the breath and not of the mind. In fact, what usually happens is, as the breath gets more and more calm, more and more subtle, to the point that it stops, you see the activity of the mind more and more clearly. When the breath stops, it's not because you're holding the breath, but simply because the activity of the mind is so calm that you're not in need of a lot of oxygen, you're not using up a lot of oxygen, you're not creating a lot of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream. So there's not that much need for your in and out breathing. Simply maintaining a perception of the breath channels in the body all being open and all connected with one another is enough to keep you going. When the breath is that still, then the events of the mind become more and more prominent, and you can watch them from that stillness. The stillness can be your foundation. At that point you can work with the other elements. Ajahn Fuang used to tell his students once they reached the stage in the meditation where the breath got really calm and still to focus first on the warmth in the body. What's the warmest spot in the body right now? Focus there and think of the warmth spreading out from that spot. Then you can do the same thing with the water property, which he identified as the feelings of coolness. Where do you feel coolest right now? Can you balance the two? It's like playing with the dials on a new stereo. You turn up the volume, turn it down, play with the balance until you get something that feels just right. Then you do the same, balancing the breath energy with the sense of earth. Sometimes if you get really into the earth element, everything gets really heavy and it can get really unpleasant, so you want to balance it out a bit. What you're learning about here is the power of perception, the labels you place on things, and how perception can have a huge impact on your feeling tone. So right there you're playing with feelings and mind states. At the same time, you're gaining a sense of what's skillful and not, which equates with analysis of qualities, one of the factors for awakening. So you've got dhammas, or mental qualities, there too. It's hard to meditate without getting everything engaged like this. But when the breath is really still, this is one of the reasons we work with it so assiduously. When the breath is very still, then we can see things very clearly, what exactly is going on in the mind, and we can sort out all of the different ways that we glom things together and turn them into huge big sticky forms of suffering. This is why, when one of Ajahn Fuang's students complained that her practice wasn't making all the fast progress that she wanted, he said, "Look, work on your foundation. Make it good and strong. Don't worry about the insights, don't worry about all the other things that you think lie down the path, because when the foundation is good, that's when the other things are possible. If the foundation isn't good, then everything else is unstable, shaky. You can think about these things, you can play with them a bit, but then they all start to fall apart. But if your foundation is good, as you stay here with your breath, then you have a foundation for understanding." When the Buddha talks about form, feeling, perception, fabrications, or consciousness, what is he talking about? You can see these things in action. Or feelings, mind states, and mental qualities. You can see them in action because you've worked through all the interference that the breath was creating. By staying here with the breath and making it really still, you've learned how to pare things down. You have hands-on experience with these different frames of reference, or the different aggregates. This means that concentration is not something just to step on and then immediately jump off and go someplace else in search of insight. You want to stay here. This is your foundation. Everything else will have to stand on this foundation. So don't let yourself do a slipshod job here. Be careful, be meticulous, because it's not just a step on which you place your foot for a bit and then jump off. This is where you're going to stay. This is your home, your Viharadhamma. Make sure to build it so that it'll last. In keeping with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the profound significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this voluminous 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. Now, the responsibility to further this noble cause rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and content shares, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's uphold the age-old tradition of sharing knowledge and fostering mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We invite you to join us in this mission, and together, we can create a profound impact on the lives of many.